China built more housing in 3 decades than the United States did in an entire century. It was the fastest construction boom in human history, a skyline rising at a pace no nation had ever seen. But now, the giants that fueled this miracle are collapsing one after another. Developers once considered untouchable are defaulting. Projects are frozen across the country, and millions of families are left waiting for homes that may never be finished. Behind the headlines lies a deeper truth, a hidden system of shadow financing, impossible debts, and political pressure that pushed the world's second largest economy to the edge. The real reasons for China's collapse were never meant to be seen, but today we rewind the story hidden in the shadows. China's real estate empire did not begin as a grand economic strategy, but as a desperate solution to a nation facing rapid transformation. In the late 1990s, China shifted from a system where state employers assigned apartments to a market where citizens had to buy their own homes. This single decision triggered one of the largest flows of private capital in modern history. Millions of families, suddenly responsible for securing their own housing, poured their life savings into pre-sale apartments. Cities expanded at unprecedented speed. Entire districts were built in a matter of months, and urban growth became the engine driving more than one-third of China's total economic activity. By the early 2000s, construction alone was supporting roughly one-fourth of national GDP, and local governments became dependent on selling land rights to developers. Nearly every province relied on real estate revenue to balance its budget, creating a cycle where growth was no longer optional, it was mandatory for political survival. Urbanization accelerated this pressure. China moved more people from countryside to cities in 2 decades than any other country in recorded history. Between 2010 and 2020, more than 100 million citizens relocated to urban areas. Developers raced to meet this demand, but demand itself shifted into something deeper than demographics. Owning an apartment became a cultural expectation. Families believed property was the safest form of wealth. Marriage prospects were tied to whether a man's family could provide a home. As a result, China's homeownership rate soared above 90%, one of the highest in the world, far above the United States or Europe. People were not buying homes to live in. Many were buying them to hold, to store value, or to secure their children's future. This belief drove an astonishing statistic. By the late 2010s, China was building enough housing each year to accommodate the entire population of a medium-sized country. Construction output surpassed the combined output of the United States and Europe. At its peak, the sector consumed more than half of global cement production and a massive percentage of worldwide steel demand. Entire ghost cities emerged, fully built districts with roads, schools, parks, and high-rises, but almost no residents. Local officials showcased these developments as signs of progress, hoping residents would eventually come. But behind the glowing skylines and ambitious planning documents, a structural imbalance was quietly growing. More homes were being produced than people were willing or able to occupy. By 2015, analysts began warning that China had enough vacant apartments to house tens of millions of people. Some estimates suggested over 60 million empty units nationwide. Yet construction did not slow. Developers depended on constant expansion because their financial models required ever-increasing pre-sale income. Buyers paid for apartments years before completion, giving companies an endless stream of cash, but also creating obligations they could no longer meet if sales slowed. When sales eventually tapered, debts that had been hidden through aggressive borrowing and shadow financing became impossible to disguise. At the same time, global conditions shifted. The trade tensions of the late 2010s weakened export stability. China's workforce growth stalled as the population began aging. In 2020, the pandemic hit, freezing construction sites and reducing consumer confidence. Property sales fell dramatically. For the first time in decades, Chinese families were no longer certain that real estate was a guaranteed investment. As demand weakened, the foundations of the entire system began to crack. Developers who had expanded too fast were suddenly unable to repay loans. Local governments, deprived of revenue from land sales, faced budget shortages. and the massive machine that had powered China's rise for more than 20 years slowed to a crawl. International observers watched closely as warning signs emerged in news reports: declining housing starts, record developer defaults, rising vacancy rates, and young consumers refusing to purchase property. Economists noted that China's real estate sector had grown so large that its collapse could affect global commodity prices, international trade routes, and even financial markets. The world's second largest economy had become dangerously dependent on one industry. What began as a path out of poverty had become a bubble so enormous that its unwinding threatened not only China's growth model, but the stability of the broader global economy. And yet the deeper causes, the hidden debts, the shadow financing networks, the political incentives to inflate growth, were still out of public view, waiting to be revealed as the crisis unfolded. Evergrande's rise began long before its name became synonymous with failure. Founded in the late 1990s, it grew during a moment when China desperately needed developers willing to build fast, take risks, and satisfy a market expanding faster than analysts could measure. Evergrande embraced this momentum with an aggressive strategy: buy land wherever possible, launch projects immediately, and fund each new development with money earned from pre-selling apartments that did not yet exist. This created a financial engine that allowed the company to grow into one of the largest developers in the world, with operations in hundreds of cities and a portfolio claiming hundreds of thousands of units. For years, China celebrated this scale as evidence of national progress, and Evergrande's founder became one of the country's richest men. But beneath this success lay a fragile structure, dependent on constant cash inflow and perpetual confidence from buyers. Evergrande's model worked only as long as sales increased. The moment they slowed, the company was forced to borrow, not just from banks, but from the shadow financing system that operated outside formal regulations. Evergrande issued high-yield investment products, promising returns far higher than typical savings accounts, attracting millions of ordinary citizens who believed in the company's reputation. These financial products were often used to cover existing debts rather than fund real construction, creating a hidden network of obligations impossible to track. By the mid-2010s, Evergrande's liabilities had grown to a sum larger than the GDP of several small countries combined. Ratings agencies quietly warned that the balance sheet was unsustainable, but the warnings were overshadowed by China's rapid growth and the belief that the government would never allow a major developer to fail. Construction sites painted a different picture. Evergrande launched projects at a pace so rapid that even local officials struggled to maintain oversight. Across provinces, thousands of apartment blocks remained unfinished, their concrete frames exposed for years, waiting for funding that no longer arrived. Families who had invested their life savings began posting videos online showing empty lots, abandoned cranes, and sales offices that refused to answer questions. Chinese social media filled with complaints from buyers demanding to know when their homes would be delivered. These voices grew louder by the late 2010s, but the company continued to downplay concerns, insisting that growth remained stable. The turning point came shortly after the pandemic began. Lockdowns halted construction and slowed sales dramatically. For a company dependent on constant inflow, even a temporary pause destabilized the entire structure. Evergrande's cash reserves evaporated quickly, and suppliers reported months of unpaid invoices. Workers in several provinces staged protests demanding wages. At the same time, international markets began paying attention to China's real estate sector as a whole. Reports from global financial institutions highlighted that China's developers were among the most heavily indebted corporate groups in the world, and Evergrande stood at the top of the list. News outlets described the company as a potential Lehman moment for China, referencing the 2008 collapse that triggered a global recession. In 2021, Evergrande officially missed multiple debt repayments. International investors raised alarms, Chinese regulators called for emergency measures, and the company's bonds lost nearly all of their value. Thousands of families who had purchased apartments discovered that their projects were paused indefinitely. In some cities, groups of homeowners organized mortgage boycotts, refusing to pay loans for properties that remained incomplete. This movement spread to dozens of regions, signaling a historic shift in public trust. Mortgage boycotts had never occurred on such a scale in China, and the government viewed them as a serious threat to financial stability. As the crisis deepened, analysts discovered that Evergrande's liabilities were far larger than previously disclosed. The company owed money not only to banks and investors, but also to construction firms, suppliers, trust funds, and millions of presale buyers. Some estimates suggested totals exceeding hundreds of billions of dollars, a weight no corporation could withstand. The government attempted to prevent panic by appointing committees to supervise restructuring, but the scale of the problem was beyond administrative control. Global markets reacted with volatility, and commodity prices fluctuated as investors feared a slowdown in China's construction sector, which consumed a vast share of the world's raw materials. Evergrande became a symbol of a broader issue, a development model that prioritized rapid expansion over sustainable growth. It demonstrated how deeply the real estate sector had embedded itself into China's economic system, and how vulnerable that system was when confidence collapsed. Each delay, each abandoned site, and each canceled repayment exposed structural weaknesses previously hidden beneath years of uninterrupted growth. The unfolding crisis showed that China's real estate empire, once celebrated as an achievement without precedent, had been built on financial mechanisms that could not survive stagnation. Evergrande's downfall was not just a corporate failure. It was the first clear sign that the foundations of the entire industry had begun to shift. China's shadow banking system did not emerge from deliberate planning, but from the gaps left behind by formal financial institutions that could not keep pace with the country's explosive growth. As real estate developers expanded across hundreds of cities, they quickly discovered that traditional banks, bound by regulations and lending quotas, could not supply the vast and continuous funding needed to sustain nationwide construction booms. Developers turned to an alternative network of trusts, wealth management products, and informal lenders that operated in a gray zone between official oversight and private speculation. This shadow system grew quietly for more than 2 decades until it became one of the largest unregulated financial ecosystems in the world, supporting not only individual companies, but the entire structure of China's property market. At the heart of this system were trust companies, institutions that promise high returns to investors willing to accept the risk of opaque lending practices. These trusts raise money from ordinary citizens, corporations, and even local governments, then funneled the capital to developers who could not secure bank loans. Investors believed that major developers were too important to fail and assumed that the government would intervene if anything went wrong. This belief created a cycle in which trust products gained enormous popularity, with wealthy households placing substantial portions of their savings into these funds. By the mid-2010s, the size of the trust industry reached trillions of dollars when converted into global currency, rivaling formal financial sectors in several developed countries. Developers relied heavily on these trust products because they offered quick access to large sums of money. Unlike banks that require detailed credit checks, trust companies often base their decisions on projected sales rather than existing assets. This allowed developers to borrow repeatedly, using future apartment sales to repay old debts and fund new projects. The model resembled a rolling financial engine that needed constant momentum. As long as homebuyers continued purchasing presale apartments, the system could function indefinitely. But without such demand, the network of obligations began to unravel. Signs of strain started appearing long before the public recognized the full extent of the problem. Analysts noted inconsistencies in trust product disclosures, including vague descriptions of loan purposes and incomplete information about collateral. Some reports suggested that developers were using multiple layers of loans to disguise their real liabilities. A single project could involve several trust companies, each unaware of the other's involvement. This created situations where the total amount borrowed far exceeded the project's actual value. Yet because trust companies operated with limited transparency, regulators struggled to track the flow of money across regions and sectors. International observers became increasingly concerned as global institutions reported that China's shadow banking practices were expanding faster than any other financial system on Earth. Economists from major research groups warned that the lack of oversight posed significant systemic risks, particularly because trust products were deeply connected to real estate, a sector already responsible for a large share of national GDP. Some compared the situation to the American mortgage crisis of the mid-2000s, noting similar patterns of excessive leverage, overvalued assets, and blind confidence in perpetual growth. These warnings circulated in economic journals and financial press, but they attracted little attention within China, where rapid development remained a point of national pride. News broke in the early 2020s that several trust companies had begun missing payments on their wealth management products. Investors, many of whom were middle-class households seeking higher returns than ordinary bank deposits could offer, demanded explanations. But the companies responded with vague statements citing market conditions. A few attempted quiet restructurings, hoping to avoid public scrutiny. Meanwhile, construction firms publicly admitted that they had not received expected funding from the usual trust partners. Projects in multiple provinces slowed or stopped entirely, as developers struggled to secure replacement capital. Images of abandoned construction sites circulated online, fueling public anxiety. The government initially downplayed the issue, stating that isolated liquidity problems were normal in a large and diverse financial landscape. But as more trust companies reported difficulties, it became clear that the problem was systemic. A growing number of investors staged protests outside company headquarters and local government buildings, demanding repayment of funds that had been advertised as safe. Authorities deployed security forces to disperse crowds and restricted online discussions, but public unease persisted. These events marked one of the rare moments when middle-class financial anxieties entered mainstream national conversation. Developers, increasingly unable to borrow from trust companies, turned to even more informal channels of financing. Private lending networks, sometimes involving multiple intermediaries, offered money at high interest rates. Such loans deepened the financial risks facing developers, creating a layered web of obligations that could collapse with even minor disruptions in cash flow. Some companies resorted to creative accounting to mask their liquidity problems, including reclassifying liabilities as assets or transferring debt between subsidiaries. While these tactics temporarily stabilized financial statements, they obscured the true level of risk in the system. Foreign analysts continued issuing warnings. Several global banks released assessments stating that China's shadow financing system was intertwined with the real estate sector so deeply that any significant downturn could trigger spillover effects across global markets. Commodity exporters grew particularly concerned, knowing that China consumed vast quantities of raw materials for construction. A slowdown in property development would reduce demand for iron ore, steel, copper, and other essential inputs, potentially destabilizing economies that depended heavily on these exports. By the time official media acknowledged rising concerns, the shadow banking system had already reached a point where losses could no longer be concealed. Reports surfaced that some trust companies were negotiating with regulators to delay or restructure repayments. Others admitted that the value of the assets backing their products had fallen sharply, leaving them unable to fulfill obligations. International journalists highlighted that these problems echoed patterns observed in past financial crises: opacity, excessive leverage, inflated asset prices, and widespread assumption that government intervention would prevent collapse. Yet China's unique political structure made the situation even more complex because regulators faced competing priorities: maintaining stability, protecting investors, and avoiding moral hazard. As China's shadow banking crisis deepened, regulators attempted to regain control by introducing new rules intended to restrict excessive borrowing and limit the flow of money into speculative real estate activity. These measures, known informally as the Three Red Lines, aimed to force developers to reduce their leverage and operate within clearer boundaries. But instead of stabilizing the sector, the regulations exposed how dependent many developers had become on opaque funding sources. Companies that had long relied on continuous borrowing suddenly found themselves unable to access either formal bank loans or shadow financing. This abrupt shift placed enormous pressure on balance sheets, and several high-profile developers disclosed that they could not meet upcoming obligations. These announcements sent shockwaves through domestic markets and led international analysts to question whether China had underestimated the scale of hidden debt within its financial system. The consequences extended beyond large corporations. Smaller developers, who lacked the political connections and diversified income streams of industry giants, were among the first to collapse. Many had borrowed heavily through trust companies and private lenders, pledging unfinished projects as collateral. When trust companies reduced lending activity, these smaller firms were cut off from capital entirely. Construction halted mid-stage, leaving landscapes dotted with half-completed towers and deserted building sites. Local economies that had depended on the real estate sector for employment and tax revenue felt the impact immediately. In some regions, residents reported entire neighborhoods where construction had frozen, creating a visual reminder of the fragility underlying China's rapid growth. Meanwhile, trust companies faced mounting public pressure. Their wealth management products, once marketed as safe and reliable, began to suffer from widespread redemptions. Investors sought to withdraw their money, but trusts could not pay out without selling underlying assets, many of which were tied to distressed developers. Some companies proposed extending maturity dates or restructuring repayment terms, but these efforts offered little reassurance. Online forums filled with videos of citizens demanding answers from trust company offices, while investigative journalists uncovered cases in which firms had misrepresented the risks associated with their products. This exposure eroded public confidence further and raised concerns about the transparency of financial institutions operating outside the supervision of the central banking system. The government responded by increasing surveillance over financial institutions and urging trust firms to disclose more information about their portfolios. However, the structural problems within the shadow banking system were too entrenched to be resolved through administrative measures alone. Local governments, facing their own financial challenges, were unable to provide substantial support. Many had accumulated enormous debts due to years of borrowing for infrastructure and development projects. Land sales, their primary source of revenue, declined sharply as developers scaled back purchases. Without the income generated from selling land use rights, local governments struggled to repay their own loans, and the financial stress rippled outward into other sectors. International markets began watching developments closely. Reports from global rating agencies downgraded the outlook for several Chinese financial institutions, citing increased exposure to distressed real estate assets. Commodity markets reacted to the slowdown in construction, with prices for materials such as iron ore and copper experiencing significant volatility. Exporting nations expressed concern that a prolonged downturn in China's property sector could reduce demand for their products and weaken their own economies. Business media outlets around the world published analyses comparing China's situation to previous financial crises in Japan and the United States, noting the similarities in speculative investment behaviors and heavy reliance on property-driven growth. Within China, a quiet shift in public sentiment was taking place. Younger generations, already struggling with stagnant wages and rising living costs, became increasingly skeptical of home ownership as a viable path to financial security. Social media discussions highlighted stories of families trapped in pre-sale contracts for unfinished apartments, workers left unpaid by bankrupt developers, and investors unable to recover money placed into failed trust products. These conversations created a widespread sense of financial anxiety that cut across age groups and social classes. The belief that real estate was a guaranteed investment, a conviction that had driven China's growth for 2 decades, began to fade. As the crisis persisted, regulators launched targeted interventions. They facilitated negotiations between troubled developers and their creditors, encouraged state-backed firms to acquire distressed assets, and attempted to restore confidence by publicizing cases of successful restructuring. But these steps faced limitations. The sheer scale of obligations within the shadow banking system made it impossible to protect every investor or salvage every project. In many cases, unfinished developments were transferred to state-owned enterprises, but these entities also struggled to find the resources needed to complete construction. The result was a patchwork of semi-abandoned sites and uncertain futures for millions of homebuyers. At the same time, financial scholars emphasized that shadow banking had become deeply intertwined with China's broader economic model. It filled gaps left by traditional banks, supported local government financing platforms, and enabled developers to expand far beyond their means. Removing it suddenly could trigger widespread instability, but allowing it to continue unchecked would prolong systemic risk. This dilemma placed the government in a difficult position, forced to choose between short-term stability and long-term reform. Neither path offered an easy solution. International observers noted that China's approach to managing the crisis differed from responses seen in Western economies during past financial collapses. Instead of large-scale bailouts or immediate liquidity injections, China relied on controlled defaults, selective restructuring, and tight information management. Officials feared that direct intervention could encourage reckless behavior among financial institutions, reinforcing the belief that the state would always step in. However, this restrained approach also meant that distress spread gradually through multiple layers of the economy, making it harder to isolate specific problem areas. By the early 2020s, several trust companies announced publicly that they were unable to meet repayment obligations. Their disclosures marked a rare moment of transparency in the shadow banking world and signaled that years of hidden risk had reached a breaking point. Financial reporters traced the connections between these trusts and some of China's largest developers, revealing a web of interdependence that shocked global audiences. It became clear that the failures were not isolated incidents, but part of a much larger unraveling of a financial structure built on confidence rather than sustainable fundamentals. The crisis drew attention from policymakers around the world, who debated whether China's shadow banking troubles could trigger global financial contagion. Some argued that China's closed capital system reduced the likelihood of international transmission, while others pointed out that the country's economic influence made any significant slowdown a potential threat to global growth. Reports from international institutions warned that prolonged weakness in China's real estate sector could dampen global demand, disrupt supply chains, and increase volatility in financial markets. The world watched as China attempted to balance the competing demands of stability, reform, and public confidence, knowing that the outcome would have implications far beyond the nation's borders. The shadow banking crisis illuminated the hidden vulnerabilities that had accumulated during China's rapid modernization. It exposed the risks inherent in a system that blended state control, market ambition, and opaque financial practices. It revealed how deeply real estate, trust financing, and local government borrowing had become intertwined, creating a structure too vast and complex to unwind neatly. And it marked a turning point in China's economic story, one in which growth could no longer mask the long-term consequences of debt-driven development. The unfolding crisis in China's real estate sector revealed structural weaknesses that had been concealed for decades, and by the early 2020s, it became clear that the government faced a challenge far greater than individual corporate failures. The slowdown in property sales exposed deep vulnerabilities in household confidence. For generations, Chinese families believed that housing was the safest and most reliable asset they could own. This belief drove the country's homeownership rate to levels far above those seen in the United States, Europe, or Japan. But as developers defaulted, trust companies collapsed, and construction sites stood abandoned, the long-held assumption that property prices could only rise began to unravel. Younger generations, already facing unemployment rates that reached record highs, questioned whether buying a home was still a meaningful investment. The cultural foundation that had supported the real estate boom weakened at a time when the economy needed it most. In major cities, buyers delayed or canceled purchases, uncertain whether developers would deliver homes on schedule. Mortgage boycotts spread across multiple provinces, with hundreds of thousands of families refusing to continue payments on pre-sale apartments that remained unfinished. These boycotts were unprecedented in modern Chinese financial history and signaled a profound shift in public sentiment. Banks attempted to calm tensions by offering temporary relief measures, but the scale of the problem made comprehensive solutions impossible. As more buyers backed away from the market, developers lost access to crucial cash flow, further slowing construction and deepening public distrust. The slowdown also struck local governments, which depended heavily on land sales to generate revenue. For years, municipal authorities relied on selling land use rights to developers as a primary source of funding for infrastructure, schools, and public services. During boom periods, these sales provided stable income, But as developers withdrew from auctions or bid far below previous levels, local government budgets contracted sharply. Some regions reported that land sale revenues had fallen by more than half compared to earlier years, creating significant financial shortfalls. Analysts warned that local government financing vehicles, which had accumulated substantial debt during periods of rapid construction, faced rising pressure as revenue streams dried up. Without adequate funding, several infrastructure projects were postponed or canceled, compounding the economic slowdown. China's demographic trajectory compounded the crisis. For decades, the country experienced robust population growth, supporting rising demand for housing. But recent census data revealed a stark reversal. The population began declining for the first time in a generation, and the proportion of elderly residents increased rapidly. Fewer young households meant fewer new homebuyers, weakening long-term demand for residential property. Economists warned that China risked following a path similar to Japan during its prolonged economic stagnation, where an aging population and declining birth rate contributed to decades of sluggish growth and falling property values. Policymakers attempted to bolster birth rates through financial incentives, but younger generations, burdened by economic uncertainty, remained hesitant. International markets took notice as China's property crisis deepened. Media outlets around the world published detailed analyses of how the slowdown was affecting global commodity demand. China had long been the largest consumer of iron ore, steel, copper, and cement, materials essential for real estate construction. As building activity declined, commodity prices experienced significant volatility, impacting economies in Australia, Brazil, and several African nations that relied heavily on exporting raw materials to China. Financial institutions issued reports warning that prolonged weakness in China's real estate sector could have ripple effects across global supply chains, affecting industries from manufacturing to technology. At the same time, China's central government faced a difficult balancing act. On one hand, officials sought to prevent a complete collapse by easing some regulatory restrictions and encouraging banks to provide cautious support to select developers. On the other hand, policymakers wanted to avoid the perception of a broad bailout, fearing that such a move would reinforce moral hazard and encourage irresponsible borrowing. The government took a targeted approach, facilitating restructuring efforts for companies deemed essential while allowing weaker firms to fail. This strategy slowed the pace of contagion but did not reverse the underlying downturn. Financial scholars noted that China's situation differed fundamentally from previous crises in Western markets. The country maintained stricter control over capital flows and banking institutions, reducing the likelihood of sudden mass withdrawals or uncontrolled collapses. But this same control limited the speed at which the private sector could adjust. Developers could not quickly liquidate assets, households could not easily shift savings into alternative investments, and local governments could not diversify revenue streams. The rigidity of the system created a slow-moving crisis, one that unfolded gradually rather than explosively, but whose long-term consequences were potentially more far-reaching. Public sentiment continued to deteriorate as news of additional developer defaults emerged. Each announcement triggered renewed concerns among families waiting for their homes, employees working for indebted firms, and investors holding wealth management products linked to real estate. Social media posts documenting stalled construction sites, empty sales offices, and protests outside developer headquarters circulated widely despite censorship efforts. These images reinforced the perception that the crisis was not a temporary disruption, but a fundamental shift in China's economic landscape. The government attempted to address these concerns by promoting narratives emphasizing stability and long-term resilience. State media highlighted successful project completions and featured interviews with officials assuring citizens that the housing market remained a cornerstone of national development. Yet these messages often clashed with lived experiences, and the gap between official statements and daily reality eroded trust further. Experts argued that restoring public confidence would require more than policy adjustments. It demanded a structural transformation of the real estate sector, one that reduced dependence on speculative investment and prioritized sustainable growth. As the crisis entered its later stages, Economists observed that China's reliance on property-driven expansion had created a vulnerability unlike any other major economy. The country's rapid modernization had been built on the assumption of ever-growing demand for housing, ever-rising prices, and a population that would continue urbanizing at historic rates. When these assumptions changed, the entire system faced a recalibration that could take years to unfold. The slowdown in construction, the weakening of household confidence, and the fragility of local government finances represented only the beginning of a much broader economic adjustment. China's leadership publicly acknowledged the need to shift toward a more balanced growth model, one less dependent on real estate and more focused on technology, advanced manufacturing, and domestic consumption. But transitioning an economy of such magnitude required time, coordination, and the delicate management of competing interests. Real estate had become intertwined with employment, household wealth, local government revenue, and national GDP. Any attempt to shrink the sector risked triggering further instability, while failing to reform risked perpetuating the imbalances that caused the crisis in the first place. By the mid-2020s, the direction of China's real estate crisis remained uncertain. Some analysts predicted gradual stabilization as restructuring progressed and market expectations adjusted. Others warned that deeper structural issues, including demographic decline and excessive household leverage, could prolong weakness for many years. What was clear, however, was that China could no longer rely on the strategies that had fueled its rise during the previous decades. The slowdown in the property market represented not just a cyclical downturn, but a turning point in the nation's economic trajectory, one that would shape the future of global markets and redefine China's path forward. The global consequences of China's real estate crisis became visible long before the full scale of the slowdown was acknowledged. As construction activity contracted across dozens of provinces, the demand for raw materials dropped sharply, triggering immediate reactions in international markets. Countries such as Australia and Brazil, which had relied heavily on exporting iron ore to fuel China's building boom, saw prices fluctuate with unusual volatility. Analysts noted that China had once consumed more than half of the world's steel and cement, and when that demand weakened, the ripple spread across entire continents. Mining companies issued profit warnings, governments adjusted growth forecasts, and currency values in resource-rich nations shifted in response to declining export revenues. Global investment firms monitored the situation closely, recognizing that the crisis extended far beyond traditional real estate. China's property sector had been deeply intertwined with domestic manufacturing, household wealth, and global trade flows. As the slowdown intensified, multinational corporations reported softer sales in markets ranging from home appliances to construction machinery. Financial institutions across Europe and North America studied the potential impact on bond markets and supply chains. Some banks warned that prolonged weakness could affect worldwide economic expectations, noting that China had been a key engine of global growth for more than 2 decades. Concerns also emerged in the energy sector. China had long been one of the world's largest consumers of coal, natural gas, and petroleum products, much of which supported construction and manufacturing linked to real estate development. As demand weakened, energy prices reacted accordingly, influencing everything from shipping costs to national budgets in exporting countries. Economists explained that China's property crisis had triggered a complex chain reaction. Reduced construction led to lower industrial output, which then decreased energy consumption, affecting producers across multiple regions. What began as a domestic financial problem gradually evolved into a global economic event. Financial markets reflected these anxieties. In major stock exchanges, investors reacted sharply to news of missed debt payments by Chinese developers and trust companies. International media outlets published analyses comparing the unfolding crisis to past global shocks, noting similarities in debt accumulation, asset inflation, and political reluctance to acknowledge mounting risks. While many analysts argued that China's closed financial system would prevent a direct international contagion, others warned that indirect channels, trade, commodities, corporate earnings, could exert significant pressure on global markets. Reports from major financial institutions emphasized that even a gradual slowdown in the world's second largest economy could reshape investment strategies worldwide. Meanwhile, central banks in multiple countries reference China's real estate downturn in their policy discussions. Some policymakers argued that reduced Chinese demand could help ease global inflation, while others warned that unpredictable fluctuations in commodity prices could complicate monetary planning. International organizations issued forecasts suggesting that prolonged stagnation in China's property sector might lower global growth projections for the coming decade. Economists pointed to Japan's experience in the late 20th century as a cautionary example of how long-term structural imbalances could persist even in highly developed economies. Within China, the government sought to stabilize expectations by encouraging foreign investment and promoting new economic sectors, including technology and advanced manufacturing. Officials emphasized that China aimed to transition toward a more sustainable growth model, one less reliant on real estate. Yet foreign investors remained cautious, noting that unresolved debt issues, uncertain regulatory environments, and weak consumer confidence presented challenges for long-term investment. Surveys conducted by international business groups indicated that many companies planned to slow expansion in China until clearer signs of stabilization emerged. The political implications were equally significant. Global observers highlighted that China's economic slowdown could alter geopolitical dynamics, affecting trade negotiations, regional partnerships, and global supply chains. Some nations viewed the crisis as an opportunity to diversify away from Chinese manufacturing, while others worried that economic stress could lead to more assertive strategic behavior. Analysts debated whether China's leadership could maintain domestic stability during a prolonged financial adjustment, particularly as youth unemployment, stagnant wages, and rising consumer uncertainty became more prominent in national discourse. Despite these concerns, China continued to project confidence in its ability to manage the crisis. State media emphasized resilience and long-term growth potential, highlighting infrastructure initiatives and technological advancements. Yet international experts noted that real estate had played a uniquely large role in China's economic model, contributing not only to GDP, but also to household wealth, local government revenue, and corporate borrowing. Adjusting an economy so deeply intertwined with property development required careful planning and a willingness to confront uncomfortable realities. The long-term consequences of the crisis remained uncertain. Some analysts argued that the worst was already visible and that China would gradually stabilize as distressed assets were restructured and market expectations reset. Others warned that deeper structural issues, aging demographics, declining birth rates, and excessive local government debt could extend the downturn for years. What seemed increasingly clear was that China's era of property-driven hypergrowth had come to an end. The world's second-largest economy faced a new chapter defined not by rapid construction, but by the challenge of managing its legacy. For the global community, the crisis served as a reminder of how interconnected modern economies had become. China's transformation had lifted millions from poverty and reshaped international trade. But its vulnerabilities, long hidden behind soaring skylines and relentless development, now influence markets worldwide. The unraveling of the real estate empire revealed the extent to which global growth had depended on a model that was never sustainable indefinitely. As China entered its economic transition, the world braced for a future shaped by uncertainty, slower expansion, and the long shadow of a crisis years in the making. This collapse is not an accident. It is the consequence of decades of hidden debts, silent failures, and truths buried under concrete and steel. China's real estate empire was sold to the world as strength, but behind the curtain it was a countdown, and now the clock has struck zero. What comes next will shake markets, governments, and millions of lives far beyond China's borders, and this is only the beginning. If you want to understand the real forces moving the world, the ones that operate in the dark, without permission and without mercy, you know what to do. Stay alert, stay critical, stay in the shadow. Shadow Rewind continues.